Hi, I'm Lena Whitmore, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the world never expects a woman to hold power without apology. I grew up watching men underestimate my mother, mock her quiet strength until she took back control, and left them stunned. Maybe that's where I get it from. But no matter how far I climbed or how sharp my mind became, there was always someone ready to reduce me to my heels. My lipstick, my last name. Damien Rowe was one of them, entitled arrogant. The kind of man who believed the world owed him praise simply for existing. We met at a charity gala hosted at a downtown hotel rooftop. I wasn't supposed to be there for business, but old habits die hard. I read faces, caught murmurs, and saw the sharks in suits swimming in circles around the next investment. Damien stood out not because of his charm, but because of his smirk. That smug, polished grin that said he owned the room before he'd even spoken. He walked up to me with the swagger of someone who assumed women like me were decoration, not competition. And when I didn't flirt back, the claws started to show. He asked who I was wearing. I answered with a market projection. He raised an eyebrow. I asked if he'd ever sat on a board that wasn't inherited. I think that's when he began to resent me. You see, men like Damien don't know what to do with women who don't play their game. Charm into dismissal, but I wasn't playing. I was observing, and when he leaned in and whispered that girls like me always want something, I knew exactly what he meant and what he feared. Later that night, I sat quietly at the back of the conference room attached to the gala. I watched Damien pitch to a room full of potential backers, half lies, half arrogance, all show. The room was dazzled. He was golden in their eyes. I cleared my throat and offered an insight. Just one. Just enough to pierce his veil. That's when he turned. That's when he chose to humiliate me, not just dismiss me. He needed to remind the room that I didn't belong, at least in his version of power. He smiled, then said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sweetheart." There was nervous, obedient laughter. He wasn't done. "Gold diggers like you don't build towers, you dig into wallets." My breath caught. Not because it hurt, but because of how calculated it was. How quickly he reached for the oldest, laziest insult in the book, and no one stopped him. No one corrected him. That's what power looks like when it's unchecked, loud, and absolutely convinced of its invincibility. I wanted to scream. I wanted to strip the room of its illusions and show them who I really was. But instead, I smiled. Calm, quiet, controlled. Because I've learned something more powerful than revenge: it's patience. You let people paint their picture of you. Let them sign it, frame it, hang it on the wall. Then, when they least expect it, you burn the whole gallery to the ground. That night, I let Damien believe he'd put me in my place. I let him think he'd won, and that made my next move even sweeter. After the meeting, he passed me without a glance. I was invisible again. The girl with expensive shoes and no brain. He didn't know about the Whitmore estate, or the legacy quietly passed down to me. He didn't know that I had already secured shares in the very tower he worked in. All he saw was a threat he believed he'd silenced. But beneath that silence, a storm had begun. The humiliation lit a fire. And I don't let fires die, fan them until they explode. And Damien, he just handed me the match. That night, I didn't cry. I made calls. I finalized deals. Venom? They never imagine you'll turn it into gasoline. I wasn't after validation. I wasn't seeking approval. I was crafting an ending he wouldn't see coming. The kind that doesn't scream, it whispers, so by the time it strikes, it's already too late. I fell asleep that night, not broken but sharper, more dangerous. The next time Damien saw me, he wouldn't be laughing. He thought he'd insulted a stranger and walked away victorious. But what he didn't realize, what none of them did, is that I never walk into a room unarmed. I came to the gala with secrets. I left with a plan. Let them think you're harmless. Let them label you, diminish you, insult you, then take everything. They thought you couldn't touch and own it. I let Damien Rowe speak his poison into the room that night. And as they laughed with him, I started preparing their silence. I wasn't always Lena Whitmore, the woman with the power to unmake men like Damien Rowe. I was once just Lena, the quiet girl in worn blazers, who sat at the back of business lectures and took notes with a second-hand pen. My father died when I was 10, leaving behind a legacy buried in sealed documents and boardroom whispers. My mother raised me alone, shielding me from the sharks circling the family estate. She worked 3 jobs, made tea in silence, and never once let me believe that wealth made us better. Whitmore name was whispered in certain circles: old money, discreet power. But after a brutal corporate betrayal years ago, my mother pulled out of public view, choosing silence over scandal. We became shadows, tucked away in a modest townhome, far from the tower my father once built. Market patterns from newspaper clippings and power from watching how my mother never flinched. We lived under the radar because she wanted to protect me from greed, from fame, from men who measured worth by appearance. I carried our legacy in silence, never announcing it, only studying it. I first saw the building when I was 16. My father's name had long been removed from its plaques, but I recognized his architectural fingerprints. Under another name, a real estate trust tried to erase our roots, but blood doesn't disappear just because the ink does. From that moment, I made a promise to myself. One day, I'd own it. I'd reclaim what was stolen piece by piece. So, I studied, waited, invested through shadow entities. The world thought the Whitmores had disappeared, but we were only learning how to fly silent. When I turned 25, I met Harold Granger, my godfather and my father's oldest friend. He was the last keeper of the original trust. He didn't offer me a silver spoon. He handed me the blueprint, the shares, the silent investors, the legal loopholes that kept our fingerprints just barely on the building. He reminded me of who I was, of what I was owed, and of the wolves I would one day face. I didn't flinch. I created a new identity in the market. That's how I became Lena Ward. Quiet, cunning, underestimated. Lena Ward became a ghost investor, peering in deals only long enough to shift power. I learned the art of anonymity, the power of not being recognized. No one knew the woman, signing million-dollar deals from behind mirrored glass, and that's exactly how I liked it. I invested in the Row Group silently when their shares dipped during a scandal. I bought in through a shell corporation. When their lease came up for renewal in the tower, I renegotiated it under another name. Slowly, piece by piece, I turned their ground into my ground, until one final move would cement my place. Damien's father, Leonard Rowe, once tried to buy out the last piece of the Whitmore estate. He made promises he never intended to keep, and when my mother refused, he called her emotional, he called her irrational, he called her everything but what she was, brilliant. I remembered every word. I remembered how she cried behind closed doors but walked out with her head held high. That humiliation had never left. Our home, it was etched into our DNA. I wasn't seeking revenge for me. I was finishing a war they started long before I ever walked into that gala. I had studied the Rows long before Damien opened his mouth that night. I knew their assets, their investors, and their cracks. I didn't just want the tower, I wanted to own the ground beneath their arrogance. I wanted to remind them that some women don't play the game, they change the board. The gala was never a coincidence. It was the final move in a sequence I had started years ago. Damien just made the mistake of accelerating the timeline, and I wasn't going to waste a single second. That humiliation had activated something older, deeper, ancestral. The Whitmore legacy wasn't about being the richest in the room. It was about endurance. We didn't scream, we endured. We didn't demand recognition. We took it when it was earned. And now, I had everything I needed. Control of the trust. A legal team more ruthless than a pack of wolves. But most importantly, I had clarity. The history wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman silenced, every voice mocked, every mother who told her daughter to wait for the right moment. That moment had arrived. And Damien, he had no idea what was coming. He called me a gold digger. He thought I was after his wallet. But the truth was, I was already standing on everything he thought he owned. Every insult he hurled, every smirk he offered, it was history repeating itself. But this time, I was ready. This time, history wasn't going to end in silence. It was going to end in shock. And when the truth hit him, it wouldn't be with fury. It would be with precision. The way my father would have done it. The way my mother taught me. With elegance. With power. And without mercy, the invitation arrived on Damien's desk, wrapped in black and gold, an exclusive meeting for top stakeholders in the Row Group's future. He thought it was another merger pitch, another chance to flex his boardroom ego. He had no idea it was carefully orchestrated. Every attendee chosen, every minute planned. The meeting was held in the Whitmore conference room, renamed temporarily under the holding firm's name. Damien walked in smirking, flanked by assistants. Unaware he'd stepped into a room where every eye already knew the secret. I stood at the end of the long table. Lena Ward, not the date, not the help. He paused when he saw Mai's narrowing lips curling into mock surprise. "You lost, sweetheart," he sneered, his voice loud enough for the room to hear. The board members didn't laugh. They looked at me, waiting. I took my seat at the head of the table. His confusion bloomed into silence. I slid a folder across the table. Inside, the proof of ownership, voting rights, controlling shares, my signature on every document. I watched the blood drain from his face. He didn't understand. Not yet. "I'm not here for your money, Damien," I said calmly. "I'm here because this company leases from me." He blinked, scanned the room, hoping someone would interrupt. Someone would laugh and relieve him of the horror creeping up his spine. No one did. "You're lying," he said, but his voice cracked. I opened the second folder. Original trust. Documents from the Whitmore estate detailing the inheritance, the tower deed, the silent transfers. The Rowe Group had been paying rent to me for the past 11 months. I was the one who renegotiated their lease. I was the one who allowed their gala in my lobby. I was the one who let Damien humiliate me in my own building. That moment shattered something in him. His jaw clenched, fists tightening as if rage would restore his position. But rage has no power in a room where facts reign. "So this was all a game to you?" he spat. I leaned forward. "No, Damien. This was a lesson. One your father never learned, and now you've inherited his blindness." Silence followed. He stood frozen, breath uneven as his board members flipped through the documents. Some nodded with quiet awe. Others shifted in their seats, ashamed. They had laughed along with him weeks ago. Their empire sat on land they didn't own. I stood slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. "I could evict you," I said softly, "but I won't." His head jerked up, hope flickering. "Not yet." I placed a final document on the table. An ultimatum. Clean up the toxic leadership culture or face public exposure and legal collapse. My legal team had built the case meticulously, every recorded insult, every discriminatory policy, every silenced employee. "This isn't about revenge," I continued. "This is about reckoning." Damien tried to speak, but words failed. I didn't need an apology. I needed transformation. And now I held the leverage to demand it. The media got the story days later, but not from me. Anonymous leaks painted the picture. A mysterious heiress, hidden power, a shattered corporate. Prince Damien's image crumbled under public scrutiny. Articles called him a spoiled figurehead, a cautionary tale of inherited arrogance. He didn't attend the next board meeting. He took a sudden leave of absence. Investors backed out. And through it all, I stayed silent. I didn't seek fame, I sought impact. The building, once stripped of my father's name, now bore the Whitmore emblem again, quietly installed in the lobby where no one could miss it. People began to whisper, "Who was Lena Ward, really?" Some guessed, few knew, but I didn't need them to know. My work wasn't for headlines. It was for the girl I once was, who walked quietly, who spoke softly, who hid her power to protect it. I didn't rise to humiliate. Damien rose to restore the dignity they tried to erase from my bloodline. I learned that real power doesn't shout. It waits, it watches, and when the time is right, it strikes so cleanly, they don't realize they're falling until they hit the ground. My mother watched the news in silence, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She never said, "I told you so." She didn't need to. Her eyes carried the weight of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer for my future. I sat beside her, no longer a girl hiding her wings. I had flown higher than they ever expected, higher than they allowed. And now, I understood what legacy really meant. It wasn't just wealth or property. It was reclaiming the space you were told you didn't belong in and building something stronger in its place. Damien Rowe called me a gold digger, but the truth was, I wasn't digging for gold. I was reclaiming a throne buried beneath their arrogance. They mocked my silence, underestimated my grace, and mistook my calm for weakness. But grace is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. I learned to fly in secret, and when I landed, they had no wings left to escape me. Damien tried to keep up appearances after the reveal, but cracks spread like wildfire. The board no longer looked to him for direction, they looked past him, toward a future that didn't include inherited entitlement. His father, once a respected titan, sent a cold, clipped message. "Handle this or step aside." Damien scrambled, tried to spin the story, claimed I manipulated him, twisted his words, seduced the room. But his arrogance had been too loud, too public. Every receptionist, every junior employee he'd stepped on, now had a voice, and they used it. HR complaints surfaced like rot beneath polished floors. Silence was no longer an option. I didn't have to lift a finger. Karma had taken the wheel, but I guided it with precision. A quiet nudge to journalists here, a released email thread there. Everything Damien said behind closed doors became public record. His worthless comment trended for a week. A recording of him mocking a disabled intern made national headlines. The board tried damage control, but the damage was cultural, systemic, and it wore Damien's face. One by one, sponsors pulled out. Shareholders called for a vote. Damien's corner office no longer protected him. It became a glass cage, and everyone outside could finally see him. His assistant, who once sneered at me, walked out. Dropping her badge on the floor, a chain reaction followed. 3 resignations in one day. Anonymous Glassdoor reviews painted a picture of a cruel, outdated empire crumbling under its own ego. Employees whispered that the building had turned on him. I never denied it. Let them think the walls watched. Let them believe I was everywhere, because I was. The Whitmore name spread through silent contracts and anonymous investment firms. Every room he entered was mine in ways he couldn't trace. I wasn't seeking revenge anymore. I was dismantling a kingdom. Damien called me once. He didn't apologize, he begged. I listened in silence. He asked me to back off, said we could make this right, said he had a future to protect. The irony of that sentence nearly made me laugh. So did I whispered. Then I hung up. The fall wasn't loud. It was slow, agonizing, and televised. He was forced to step down voluntarily. The media labeled it a leadership transition, but those of us who knew the truth knew it was an execution. He walked out of that building for the last time, with no cameras, no applause, no legacy. Asterisk. I walked in the next day and claimed his office not out of pride, but symbolism. The same space where he called me garbage now held my breath, my silence, my signature. I redecorated nothing. I left his leather chair and his ego on the floor where he left them. The staff didn't question it. They nodded as if it had always been mine, and maybe in some way it had. Not the office, but the respect, the authority, the control. He thought I wanted to steal. I had never needed to steal it. I owned it long before he knew my name. Damien disappeared from the business circuit. Last I heard, he was consulting for startups, pretending humility. He'd traded Armani suits for linen apologies. But reputation is a shadow you can't outrun. His name still tasted like rot in every boardroom he tried to enter. Doors once held open for his surname, now closed quietly before he arrived. Meanwhile, the Row Group restructured under new leadership, a woman I personally recommended. Someone who once fetched coffee and now made million-dollar calls. We rebuilt the company from the ground up, but we left one crack in the wall so it would always remember how it broke. My mother passed shortly after the transition. She never saw Damien fall, but she saw me rise. She called it justice. I called it restoration. I kept her scarf in my office draped over the chair, soft as her voice. Every time I wanted to scream, I touched it. It reminded me that revenge isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes it's a quiet wind that topples giants. Damien thought he humiliated me in front of a room. He never imagined that same room would one day salute me, but I never needed their applause. I just needed the silence that followed. In that silence, I found my power. I found every piece of myself he tried to shatter. I looked out from the top floor of the building. He mocked me, and Anne smiled. Not because I destroyed him, but because I didn't let him destroy me. The girl he called a gold digger had become the architect of his ruin, and I didn't lift a single weapon. I just waited. I listened. I documented. And when the time was right, I opened the floodgates. The fall was his. But the rise was mine, and it was quiet, glorious, and unstoppable. This wasn't revenge. This was resurrection. They clipped my wings when I was younger. They laughed at my silence, mistook it for fear, but I learned to fly without noise. And when I soared, I made sure the world saw who they tried to bury. Damien's empire is a memory now. Mine is legacy. And legacies don't need approval. They write themselves into history. The morning after Damien's final exit, the sun hit the glass facade of the building differently. It felt like a rebirth. The lobby echoed not with his voice, but with the calm confidence I carried in every silent step. Employees looked me in the eye, now not with fear, not with flattery, but with respect earned, not demanded. I didn't walk in with vengeance anymore. I walked in with vision, the kind of vision built in shadows, shaped by humiliation, and tempered in silence. Every woman who had ever been doubted, mocked, or dismissed stood with me whether they knew it or not. I made it a rule no one would ever be spoken to the way I had been. Not on my floors. I rewrote policies, redrew hierarchies, and reshaped a culture built on elitism. The old guard resisted briefly, but even they understood change was no longer optional. People stopped whispering. They started speaking. I promoted the intern Damien used to ignore. I hired the receptionist who once cried in the stairwell. Power, I learned, wasn't about dominance. It was about who you lift when no one's watching, and I was always watching now, out of paranoia, but purpose. This time, I held the mirror. My story reached ears I never expected. Universities invited me to speak not about success, but survival. Women wrote me letters, some from countries I'd never set foot in. You made me believe I could, they said, and that changed everything. My pain had planted seeds I never meant to grow, but now they bloomed in strangers who finally saw themselves. I never thought revenge would turn into leadership. I never imagined my silence would become someone else's permission to speak. But here I was, a name once whispered with pity, now spoken with pride. I became the woman I once needed. I started investing not just in buildings, but in people. Girls from broken homes, women returning to work after years of being told they were too late. I funded dreams, whispered in kitchens, and kept in diaries. I created rooms where no one had to prove their worth to enter, and every time I signed a check, I thought of Damien. Not with anger, but clarity. He had called me a gold digger. He had no idea I was a gold mine. My wealth wasn't in money, it was in memory. And I remembered everything, every slight, every smirk, every time I was told no. Now, the world asked me how I did it, as if I had a blueprint. I never had. 1. I had scars. I had silence. I had nights I cried so quietly, not even the walls knew. But I also had grit, the kind that can't be taught, only earned. And I carried that grit into every boardroom, every closed-door negotiation, every sleepless night. Damien had privilege. I had purpose. That's why I rose. Not faster, but stronger. Not louder, but deeper. My roots were made of fire, and that fire didn't just burn, it built. People feared failure. I turned it into foundation. I visited the rooftop one evening alone. No assistants, no cameras. Just me and the skyline I once dreamed of from cheap apartments and broken promises. I stood where Damien had once boasted, and I breathed. Not because I needed to prove anything anymore, but because I'd finally exhaled all the lies they fed me. I was never less than. I was never lucky to be here. I was the reason the roof existed. I didn't steal a seat at the table. I built a new one, and I made sure the doors stayed open, especially for those who were told they didn't belong. The building stood tall, but I stood taller. Not in height, but in weight. The weight of truth, of resilience, of legacy. They say success is the best revenge. I disagree. Peace is, and I had it now. No ghosts, no grudges, just clarity. Damien was a chapter, but I was the author, and I had more to write. My ascent wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The world would keep underestimating women like me, and women like me would keep rewriting the rules. Not for approval, not for applause, but because we must, because we know what happens when we stay silent. My name is Helena Rowe. A man once called me garbage. Today my signature sits at the bottom of contracts worth millions. That's not revenge. That's reality. And reality, once changed, cannot be undone. I no longer look back to prove anyone wrong. I look forward to build, to protect, to empower. I don't need revenge anymore. I've outgrown it. I've replaced it with legacy. And legacies, unlike empires built on ego, don't crumble. They multiply. So, when they ask me what I learned, I tell them, never let anyone else name your worth. Especially not someone too small to see your wings. And if there's one lesson, I want the world to remember, it's this. Silence is not weakness. It's preparation. Some of us are born loud. Some of us are made quiet by force. But the quiet ones, we rise. Not in chaos. In precision, we rise knowing exactly who tried to break us. And when we soar, we don't scream. We don't boast. We simply fly high enough that they can never reach us again.